to introduce a very power panel. We've got Randy Love standing at the podium with Ishwar Muleshwaram, Amy Reese, and Tina Zwadek. And they're going to be talking to us about data citations and, what to expect in the age of AI. So I'm all ears. Over to you guys.
Thank you. Well, sounds like cymbals going, eh?
Yeah, I know. It's like you build up.
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody. Hope everyone had a good break and getting toward the end of the day, so we'll try to keep you awake with some good stimulating conversation. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to give a little bit more of an introduction as to what they do, where they do it, and that type of thing, and then we'll jump in. So, Amy, why don't you go ahead first?
My name is Amy Reese.
Oh, you know what? Do we have a microphone? There we go. Should be on.
Hello.
There you go.
Okay, my name is Amy Reese. I am the Institutional Repository Outreach Librarian at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Before that, I was the head of systems and digital strategies at North Dakota State, where I managed a DSpace repository and a content DM. So I've been in repositories for about 15 years. So, and at UAB is the first place where we've really dealt with data. So it's a work in progress.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. My name is Ishwar Chandrabalishwaran. I'm actually a program director at the National Institutes of Health and serve as the program officer for the program that Randy and Tracy manage with NIH. I'm situated in the office called the Office of Data Science Strategy, and we work on coordinating and implementing NIH's strategic plan for data science. By training, I'm a genome informaticist, and over time, I've kind of become an architect of data and systems across the board. And primarily, I function in the role of leading three major NIH-wide initiatives, one that focuses on data resources across the landscape, whether they starting from some simple generalist repositories all the way to very complex domain-specific repositories. The second program is focused on sustaining software. Most of our grants have become kind of data intensive and develop software, and you won't believe how often these are replicated over and over again in every funding opportunity and grant. So we try to kind of pull that out into a program and build that into a sustainable software and building communities where people can reuse software. And the last one is really advocating for best practices in data stewardship and how things need to change through the data life cycle so that we can better manage and share the data that comes out of all of our research opportunities. So.
Hi everyone, my name is Tina Zdovchek, and I am currently a product manager with the Analytical and Data Services team at Elsevier, but I've worn a lot of hats in my team. One was R&D program manager until a little while ago, also data analyst, and I continue to do all of these things. I'm on a very fun team that gets to do a lot of custom research analytics and research evaluation. And I have the fortune of working with Ishwar and Randy on the NIH GREI project on a sub-project that worked on linking publications to data sets. So So.
Great, thanks. So we wanted to bring this team together just to kind of give you that perspective of from a funder perspective, an institution perspective, and Tina gets to play several roles, being a researcher in her past, a data analyst, and also working for Elsevier as a publisher. So I just get to moderate and ask questions, and I'm saving the hardest ones for Tina.
Great, thanks.
Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, which Ishwar is the program manager for, and we've been working together now for just over 4 years. And the project brought together 7 of the best known generalist repositories, and in what is kind of considered this coopetition model, where we're competitors, but we work together on this project, which has been very interesting and it has gone very well. At its core, I guess it's to really, our goal is to help researchers, make it easier for them to share their data in different ways. And our part of the project is really focused on Mendeley Data, which is our free generalist repository that we make available to any researcher. But there's quite a bit of different ways and different options. So if you haven't looked at the GREI project, we've got some QR codes up here that, not up there yet, QR codes up there that you can look into the project. We share a lot of different information and data, different use cases, different stories, user stories about how people are using the data. So I encourage you to look into it. We also do quite a bit in the area of webinars, in just trying to teach researchers, how best to do this and how to choose. And that's, one of the big questions that comes up a lot of times is, there's so many different places for them to, store their data. You have domain-specific repositories, you have the institutional repositories like Digital Commons and Digital Commons data, but then there's this generalist repositories, and that's kind of where this project is focused. And so one of the things that, one of the biggest questions all the time is, well, which one do we choose? If we decide if there's not a domain-specific repository for me, there's not my institution doesn't have a repository for me, I'm going to use a generalist repository, which one do I choose? And so we tried to simplify that. We put together a comparison chart, which we constantly update to help guide people. And then we took that a step further and recently released this repository selection workflow tool. And it's basically a PDF where they can kind of go through it. At some point, we may even look to automate this or, put it into a software solution of some sort. But at this point, they can kind of step through the different gates and figure out, okay, how much do I want to store? What is the source? What type of data am I storing? And it kind of guides you through and asks you certain questions and leads you to what, in many cases, will list several of our different repositories, but in other cases, it might zero in on just one. So we encourage you to use these tools. But let's look back briefly at the Chicago EIC. How many people were at the EIC that we did in Chicago last year? Most? Okay, cool. Well, at that time, Tracy and Ishwar kind of did a sit-down session where they talked about, several different things related to the GREI project and to, data sets in general. Let's get my notes caught up here. And one of the things that came out, many things came out of that, but some of the things that I recognize were, customers, many of you talked about how you were, how you were managing your data sets, and some were using generalist repositories, some were using their DCIR as almost a data catalog and pointing to where that data might be living. And so, but one thing that didn't really come up that much was, whether or not you were minting the DOIs. In digital commons data, your DOIs are minted automatically. In DCIR, you can have metadata that includes it if you mint them by other means. But it's very important, and it really lends itself to the ability to be able to share. And so that's what, we want to kind of get to a couple of points that came out of last year. And this was, something you talked about, Ishwar, in last year's. I went back and watched the video. If you don't get a chance to do that, it's kind of interesting to go back and see what we talked about in prior years. But at that time, Ishwar, you said data sharing was up, but reuse was not as great. And, it came about, how do you make your data more useful and usable for somebody other than yourself? And so, Ishwar, on this point, I know it's been, less than a year since then, but do you know, are we seeing any improvements in these areas?
So, as far as sharing goes, that's loud. As far as sharing goes, I think we've definitely seen increase in sharing. Reuse, I don't think so as much as we'd like it to be. And there's two main reasons for that, at least in my simplistic view of it. One is just, I think there's still not enough information about that data, and the not so good word about that label for that is metadata. So that's the big problem. And the other problem we heard earlier today is people are still reluctant, and that's to share data because they're not quite sure how they will be credited or cited. So I think those are kind of some of the underlying things. One is somewhat technical in terms of how do you capture the structured metadata and make that available, and the other is a little bit social, and that's kind of where the GREI program focuses on addressing both the social and technical infrastructure enhancements to kind of incentivize researchers to share. So the short answer to your question is not quite there, but I hope that we're on the right path to improve some of these data stewardship practices to getting to that point. And of course, I think the open data, state of the open data report last year also kind of spoke to some of these things and what enhancements can be made to improve the reuse of data and measure appropriate metrics associated with that.
Well, while you have the mic, I also had a follow-up question to that. Just, we talk about this mindset of other people using your data. And, I guess what I'm wondering is, researchers have a ton of work to do. There's so much going on. What do we have to do, or what can be done to try to persuade them to move into that mindset so that they are looking at it from the standpoint of how can I make this data usable by others from the onset when I'm creating it? Do you have any ideas around that?
You mean what should they do, or how do we kind of?
Why would they want to? What's in it for them? Might even be the question.
I think if done right, they get credit for it, or they should get credit for it. But the hard part is how do you do that, and how do you track that down? In the traditional citations and giving credit, that doesn't quite happen, and that's where I think use of persistent identifiers can, help showcase to them that, they do benefit from that, and they may not have been realized that their data is being used and they're being credited for that. So I think at least the approach we are using in the data stewardship project is, how do we kind of incentivize and build carrots for them, or rather give them carrots rather than not build it, rather than use the stick? Because there's the policy that we have from a federal perspective that you've got to share, but if they share it without the right legs or the metadata and the other information, it's as good as not sharing it. So I think that's kind of where the carrots come into play, of how do you make them see the incentives for that, and the simplest thing is giving credit to that and making them see that their data has a value beyond themselves. And in fact, we've had some very good exemplars where they've showcased greater publications coming out through a collaborative effort of sharing earlier on in the life cycle of the project rather than holding on to it all the way through to the end just to get your singular publication. So there's evidence of it, but it's not quite past the tipping point yet to kind of see that pervasively happen.
Okay. Pass that to Amy. And Amy, so as a librarian and you're supporting researchers, I got to move this. A little bit of Italian background. I tend to talk with my hands. So as a librarian who supports researchers, what do you think, A, that this mindset is feasible, and B, what are you doing to help?
Well, that's a kind of a loaded question. At University of Alabama, Birmingham, we have a dedicated data services librarian, and she's always talking with researchers about making their data usable for the next person coming along. And she's made a lot of headway with that, but the big question is, who's the audience for reusing the data? And I think there's still a love affair with being the first to discover something and to be the one to generate the data, and using somebody else's data for either replicability or for putting your own spin on it hasn't become sexy enough for researchers to really embrace that idea. So what we're doing at UAB is trying to teach the students that reused data has value, and that maybe in evaluating what researchers have already done with the data, they can maybe see some flaws and take that data and maybe spin it in their own way so that they can get a little more use out of it. We sit on the Data Discovery Collaborative, and that's a question that we're all struggling with. There's, I think now about 12 institutions that are involved in that collaborative, and we're all having struggles with getting the data reused.
Tina, so putting on your researcher hat for this one, when you were generating data in your studies, did this ever cross your mind that I should be doing this with the thought of somebody else doing it? And if so, what would motivate, if so or if not, what would motivate you, or what did motivate you to do so?
Yeah, that's a good question. And also, I failed to mention in my intro, so as a researcher, but I have a background in educational psychology and a PhD. And so I think that's the capacity within which you're asking me this question. I wear many hats, and that's another one of them. But yeah, it's a really good question. I think as a researcher, there's so many competing motivations that it can be really difficult for this to surface to the top. I think a lot of researchers are well-intentioned and they want to make their data reusable, but you have to publish quickly, and so anything on the path to trying to get something published quickly while it's still timely, that's going to take time and is not necessary to get that publication out, tends to get put on the back burner. Also, the thing that makes academic research so great and unique is that peer review is deeply embedded into our culture and systems, but that is also just another way of saying that we all criticize each other. And it's a good thing, but also it's really scary because you're always putting yourself out there. To be open to criticism and making your data available is just another way to sort of open yourself up to that and be vulnerable. And so I think a lot of people try to sort of get around this while still being open to it by, putting in their data availability statements that data is available upon request. We see that a lot in my other capacity as a research analyst at Elsevier when looking at data availability statements, right? And so all of these things sort of make it difficult for that to surface to the top. I'm also, as a psychologist, you have the added sort of difficulty of balancing openness and transparency with privacy, PII, security, those risks. As much as we try to de-identify data, there's always a risk of re-identification if you don't go through it properly. And so there's so much that goes into that, there are data sets that I've worked on for the government in a consultative capacity where it's required. And I spent hundreds of hours on the data set itself, making sure it was prepped, making sure I wrote down everything that went to de-identify, putting the code book together, all of that. And it's just something that's really tough to ask a researcher or a grad student to do with their already very limited time.
Could I just add to that? Yeah. So I think Tina raises a really important point, but that's why it's all the more important to do it earlier in the life cycle of the project. It's almost like writing code, and you write 10,000 lines of code and then you try to compile it and have 200,000 errors, and then you finish the project, put it in GitHub, and then you get a whole ton of criticism, as opposed to open development. And I'm talking about this as a digital object, not just as data sets, but software is the same as well. So if you do that open development and every day you have a working, running code that may do no function, but every day you add a new function, and then before you know, by the end of the year or so, it's quite a rich set of functions and capabilities. So I think it does take time, but doing that incrementally over the life cycle makes it much more doable. Yes, it may take a little bit more time, but it's also good training, and that rigor is required, and which would hopefully reduce the number of retractions down the road. So I think investing in that upfront is worth the effort, and then once you do that a couple times, it becomes second nature, and that's how you've changed your approach to managing data that you're generating differently from what was done decades ago. Or and I still see young investigators who start a lab, doing exactly what their mentors did and their mentors did, and that's not exactly you want to set up a new lab or a research group. Of course, they are much more amenable to using new tools and technologies and things like that. But still, the traditional approach of setting up a lab has not changed dramatically. Of whether you're using completely digital tools, electronic lab notebooks, and what is that workflow of tools that you use where the data can flow in a smooth way rather than kind of a bumpy ride, as we were talking over lunch about. The flow of data over there.
I think I'm going to add to that and say that discovery is probably the biggest barrier that we're experiencing on the library's side. People don't know if they discover the data set in one of these generalist repositories, they generally aren't linked to the articles that are the product of that research data. And so I think there needs to be more two-way discoverability between the articles and the data. And until that link is a little more codified with DOIs pointing to the article from the data set, because the article already has the link to the data. The data doesn't often have the link to the article. So you don't have that two-way give and take. And that's, I think, the part that's needed for people to really look at the data and really reuse it.
Yes, I think a common thing I'm hearing here too is about early researchers, and you mentioned students, and I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, how important it is to teach the students that, so that when they do it, they're not just following in the footsteps of their mentors, but they're actually, embracing the new ways and these new mindsets of doing things. So, we also want to talk about, from this discussion, we talk about topics, issues, and concerns, about sharing data, finding data, and reusing data. So on the sharing data perspective, why do it? When do you do it? How do you do it? And Amy, when we talked, you mentioned that you had kind of built a data catalog, and you were taking that approach. So can you kind of describe, what you did and how it's working, and what you do specifically about the DOIs, and so that they can be easily linked?
Right. We built a research data catalog in Digital Commons, and it's basically a catalog that links out to data in the generalist repositories where the data lives. What we do is we do a harvest of those generalist repositories with I just had a brain freeze. But we harvest the data metadata out of the generalist repositories and put it in our Digital Commons repository and link out to the data. Whenever possible, we try to link to the articles as well, so that it's kind of a one-stop shop for discovering more about this particular research, so that they've got the resulting article and the data together in one place. And I think that's one of the things that so many of the generalist repositories kind of miss out on, is they don't link back to the articles. So, I mean, yeah, you've got these data sets, and you may have 10, 12 data sets from a research experience, but they're individual items. They don't link to each other, they don't link to the article, and having that holistic view of the research is what students really need to understand what the data does to support the research. So, I mean, we're trying to teach students how to do the research and how to understand how it all supports the science that we're all trying to advance. And I think we're at a point where it could really become a lot bigger than it is currently.
Ishwara, you like to comment?
I think Amy raises a really big challenge in terms of data being scattered all over the place. And so we funders ourselves sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot, or should I say the head, by setting some expectations to share data, but then don't realize that how these are all not getting connected together, tying to that hypothesis-driven research project or that publication. And it's a collective effort. It's not an easy task for the repository or the librarian curator alone to do it. It's a collective effort of the research team to do it along the way. So I think a systematic approach, again, kind of incrementally built, where everybody is packaging and grouping these collections of data that are associated with publications. Forget about those that are not associated with publications and are still relevant, but even if we do this first part, I think it's a huge leap ahead in terms of being able to trace the provenance of data tied to publications, the replication of those results and research projects, and improving the overall rigor of research and its reproducibility.
I think if we look at it kind of as a workflow, as far, who's responsible then? I mean, the funders are saying, hey, thou shalt share your data. The journals are saying, hey, you should, share your data. Everyone's telling people that they need to share their data, but they don't always tell them how. Or so, from a workflow perspective or responsibility perspective, where does that lie?
I think I put the cart before the horse. I answered the question in some ways to Randy's question over here. And that's why I think it's a collective effort, and I think every stakeholder has a role to play, and even if one of them doesn't, then you don't quite achieve that. So what I think what's really important is for researchers to take ownership for this, putting on the hat of somebody else if they were looking at somebody else's research and they wanted to use it. And in fact, everybody does it. They do it only in the context of their project or that one particular thing that they're doing, but not in everything that they're putting out there for others to use. They're only looking at it from the point of view of, can I get this through a publication? So the one example that I could give that kind of goes back to maybe the late 80s, or whenever the National Center for Biotechnology Information at the NIH was set up, and genomic nucleic acid research kind of exploded, basically, NCBI and the database called GenBank that collected those required everybody to generate something called an accession number, so which goes with, an alphanumeric character, basically. And after all these years, maybe 4 decades or so, these are still not quite considered persistent identifiers because they don't quite meet the definition. And that's something that we're trying to figure out, how do we elevate and bump them into and including PubMed IDs. These are universally used, where everybody is required to put their publications associated, and anybody in the genomic and omic field that's generating nucleic acid sequences has to get an accession number before it can be published. So the publisher will not publish it. So that's all the stakeholders kind of involved over there, but we don't have this level of rigor in any of the other domains and fields where data types are being generated. But this cycle is not closed, so something kind of remains, so you just don't quite have that associated. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Even for us in other health-related domains, we don't quite have that. But I think that makes it effective across the board for everybody to, every stakeholder to play a role in that part.
I know the project that you refer to, so we worked on something called research data discovery, where in light of the fact that many researchers don't necessarily have these DOIs on their data sets or necessarily cite them properly, we were trying to use machine learning algorithms to go through publication text and try and identify these data sets. So having that sort of thing makes that work much easier. AI certainly helps with being able to do that sort of thing now, but we can take much quicker steps if people properly cite their publications and they're uniquely linked. I was thinking about this question earlier today, so sorry. I have my own notes because it's a good one, and I think there's a lot of different components to it. There's a few that I mentioned a little earlier, but in terms of having like code books and dictionaries and all the documentation, that's something that's really important as well. That way, it's not that people are able to just find your data sets, but they understand what you did with them, and so they are able to sort of understand if you actually ended up cleaning stuff, what did you clean, what might have been changed through your processes, why might they not be able to replicate it, or what they should do if they're trying to replicate a similar data set in a different demographic or something like that. Something else I mentioned earlier, but addressing the ethics and privacy elements, I think is also really, really important just in terms of transparency. And then this one is one that's close to my heart because of RDD, but towards the end of that project, something that we were really trying to figure out is when a researcher mentions a data set in whatever capacity in a publication, is that their data set or are they reusing a data set? And that's not something that you can surface through metadata fields that exist. It's not something that you can really surface very well without going into the publication, except if you have a data availability statement and you write it clearly there. That's a lot easier for people to be able to understand and find and to be able to surface good signs of data set reuse. So I think that one I would say is a really big one as well.
One of the things also is that
It's on.
when researchers reuse the data, are they actually reusing the data as the original researcher intended, or are they taking their own spin on it and making leaps that the original researcher never thought that anyone would take?
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, that's how you use the data doesn't necessarily dictate that you use it the same way the person created it. I think that's part of the beauty of reuse, is that you find other ways to use it and to leverage that data. From the standpoint of, we've all obviously talked about the importance of metadata. When we look at AI, do we think, AI can help with this problem, with making for better metadata, with the linking problem? Are we ready for it? How can it help? Can it help? Thoughts?
I think it can help. Researchers, to be honest, suck at assigning metadata. And they need all the help that they can get to assign metadata that will make their work more discoverable. And if AI can help them by looking at an abstract or some text version of what they're researching, then I'm all for it. I think the discoverability of the research data is a big problem, and anything that we can do to get better metadata so that other people can discover the research, I think it's going to improve data reuse.
Ishwar, thoughts?
So, a thought that crossed my mind for that question is, when we generate data and put it into a database or a repository, we just think about it being used by humans. The moment we shift our mind for it to be used by machines and make it machine readable, I think, its utility use for AI becomes much greater. So a good part of making the data AI ready is about its machine readability and how that's being packaged. And in fact, folks argue, this is part of generalist repositories versus domain-specific repositories. There's always this tension between, I think it's much more useful if it's in a domain-specific repository, and we recommend that based on the domain and things. But if you actually package the data in a structured, machine-readable way and make it available in the right context in a generalist repository, it could be as useful and usable as in a domain-specific repository in certain contexts. Of course, certain use cases are supported by certain databases, and that's perfectly fine. But for the most part, if we put a PDF, whether you put it here, there, or anywhere else, it's the same PDF, and it's only extractable to that extent. So I think the machine readability is the key part in all of our systems, and how do we make sure we keep that in mind when we are generating data? In fact, when we generate data, it is coming out of a machine, so it's kind of machine readable, but we change it to human and then kind of package it in a way that can't be read by another machine down the workflow or in that flow of data cycle. So I think machine readability there is key, and keeping that in mind is important. And this is something that core centers, all of the universities, I'm sure, have core centers that are generating all these high throughput data sets, and they all try to keep this in mind when they're generating it, so that when they bring that back to the librarians and the stewards to get it into a system, it's much more structured and packaged. And they're very eager and interested in understanding what are the community best practices to kind of support that packaging so that it becomes much more useful downstream.
So if we create it correctly and we put it in a place that, or in a format that's machine readable, it doesn't really matter where it is because AI will be able to find it.
I think that having machine readable and human readable metadata is equally important because it's the humans that are going to be doing the subsequent research that's based on the data. They're still going to need to be able to find it. And the lovely thing about metadata is there's no limits on how much you can assign. It's just, the only limits are what you put on it.
Tina? Yeah.
I was just going to add that I think one of the really cool things that I learned about through NIH GREI that I did not know existed and is something that the project has been working to implement across their repositories is fair signposting, and I think that speaks to some of the things that you have both said, but to be able to put those links to other digital objects in addition to other metadata right in the link to a document and be able to do that is so immensely helpful for using AI and leveraging the metadata to do this sort of discoverability and reuse.
I think the thing that worries me a little bit about AI, and I say this anytime I talk to anybody about AI, is you have to be smarter than AI to know when it's wrong. And so, especially with early researchers, if they become dependent on it, even just to assign metadata and things like that, if they don't know when it's not correct, then, you know, garbage in, garbage out.
We've had a couple of conversations about this at our library, and we're kind of leaning toward the idea that researchers need to do more to match up the titles of their articles with the supporting data. When they put the data in the repositories, they don't name them in a way that's meaningful to the ultimate research. I mean, Dataset 10 doesn't tell you what it's about. So I think researchers need to be a little more conscious about how they name their data sets.
Yeah, that is so crucial. In fact, remember we did some training on how do you name your files so that it just doesn't say stuff.xlss or something like that. But a couple things over here. So one is to Amy's point, I think the mindset that folks have right now is trying to be in compliance. I don't think they're trying to do this sharing or managing in a way that that they think is going to further the research. So I think they have to shift that mindset from just compliance. So when they do that, they will revisit the databases and the data that they put out periodically to make sure that it's still, you know, what is the larger context of it, rather than just putting it out there once. And in fact, I suggested to the generalist repositories and even to some of the other domain-specific folks is like, how often do people come back? Are they power users coming back to regularly share more stuff and data that they're generating in other digital objects? Or is this just a one-time compliance issue that they throw something over the wall and they forget about it? And so, in fact, I was sharing with Pramita over lunch that we're trying to organize what we call a do-a-thon. I didn't create that term, somebody else did, I just copied that. But But the thing is, just looking at who the clientele in the repositories and the resources today are, and encouraging them to come back and enrich that information or what we call metadata over there so that it's actually kind of more useful, or they left a vital piece of information. It's like, hey, come over to my house for a party, but you don't give them the address. It's like, is missing metadata over there. You don't say, that person doesn't say, give me the metadata of how I should get there. They just say, give me your address. So I think it's the parlance and the language that we use to kind of incentivize these people to come back, update this information over there, and keep revisiting the resource to kind of enrich their data that they've put, and then come back and learn what's new. The other point that Tina mentioned about connecting digital objects, this is a key requirement for the generalist repositories. Is like, how do you look at these things in computer science and database 101? You basically are taught primary keys and secondary keys to connect things over there. So this is really the connecting the digital objects through the use of persistent identifiers needs to go all around. And as embarrassing as it is to kind of call this out, we have programs that recruit the same patients, but they have different notations in the database. So you have one X study and one Y study. It's a subset of the patients are the same, but it takes a huge effort to figure out, or sometimes impossible to figure out after the fact, that it's the same patients. And of course, the patient does not get the collected data back together also of one study's results accumulated on top of others to even look at correlations and patterns from the from disease prognosis or whatever it is that we're studying. So connecting these digital objects to enable that connectivity associated going from the paper to the data to the individual, if it's clinical, or to whatever other thing, that connectivity is so important, and we're trying to encourage that between and across repositories. And that's kind of the first step of building more complex interoperable connections between systems to allow new use cases and new questions to be asked between and across data sets. Without that, you don't know where to make a beginning.
We're trying to work with the next generation of students to do more of that type of linking so that their data is more useful going forward. We've kind of come to the realization that the generation of researchers that's on the verge of retiring aren't going to change. So we've kind of let them go, but we're really focusing a lot of effort in educating the current crop of grad students to do it right.
Great.